Welcome to the Animal Training Fundamentals Podcast, where we have fun with practical application and we get mental with the science of behavior. Put them both together and you get results, solutions for your behavior problems, and the tools you need to achieve your training goals. I'm your host, Barbara Heidenreich. Let's talk training. Well, hello, animal training enthusiasts. I'm back with another podcast. I'm so excited to be talking with you once again. This time, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of talking while training. I have to admit, when I watch videotapes of me training, sometimes I'm really chatty. Like when I'm training my dog, I think I tend to be a little bit more chatty. But other times I'm really super focused and I'm really quiet. And I think it depends on the species or individual animal that I'm working with. And so it got me thinking, why is that? Why is it that sometimes I'm really quiet and sometimes I tend to be a little bit more chatty? I've also noticed that I tend to talk a lot when I am coaching somebody else. Well, no, I take that back. I don't always talk. If I want the trainer to be very focused on the animal, especially if they're working with a dangerous species, I'm very conscientious of being very quiet and waiting till after the session is over. But if it's something like, I want to give them some positive reinforcement during the session, like very specific feedback that like, yes, you're right on track. That's exactly right. Keep doing that. Perfect. I'll do things like that. But I tend to mostly keep my mouth shut. I don't want to give them like techniquey things that involve a lot of concentration on their part because I want them to stay focused on what they're doing, and I'll give them that feedback afterwards, and then maybe we'll have another session and implement it. So I am aware of that when I'm giving feedback. And I also notice that when I watch videos of myself giving information to people, that I'm so predictable. I know exactly what I'm going to say and when I'm going to say it. Sometimes when I'm giving our You Be the Behavior Consultant live streams, I'll actually say the exact same phrase over myself saying that phrase in the video. That's how predictable I am. Oh, it's kind of pathetic. Anyway, back to our topic, the pros and cons of talking while training. So let's talk about when you're training an animal. Do you talk or do you not talk? And are there benefits to it? Are there some maybe some fallout to it when it happens? I thought maybe we'd start with the pros. So for me, I think there are some pros to it. First of all, we know for some animals, it can be a conditioned stimulus. In other words, some of our animals learn that when we start talking, it means, hey, something's about to happen here. And usually that can be a good thing, right? If training is fun for your animal. So like, I think a great example in my home, and maybe in your home too, is for my dog, if I start saying certain phrases, he definitely knows something good's going to happen, like especially when we're getting ready to go for a walk, because he loves going for a walk. So if I start saying certain things, even if I haven't gone to like pick up my shoes or reach for where the harness is or things like that, he's already getting that body language and that light in his eyes that says, oh, we're going to go for a walk. Or if I say something about, a certain food item or treat, he might get a little bit excited and show, again, some body language. Or maybe you've had that kind of experience when you're talking about maybe, your partner or a preferred person that your animal likes. Maybe they're on their way home and you're saying, oh, are you excited to see so-and-so? You might see those phrases as things that your animal understands or views those as conditioned stimuli. So these animals begin to associate those with good things that they anticipate. And of course, they may be associated with other stimuli in the environment, like I said, walking towards the door or the treat jar or picking up the items that have to do with going for a walk, if we're talking about a dog here. But I did want to talk about some other situations in which I've used language or talking or making sounds that were helpful in our training. So a really good example was recently on a consultation. We were working with a crane that was showing aggressive responses towards people. And so we did use the strategy that we talked about in our most recent podcast, where we wanted to reinforce calm responses as opposed to aggressive responses whenever we were approaching the crane and the crane was approaching the mesh where we were. But the way the setup was, And just to elaborate on that, so if the crane was giving us a calm response, we would remove ourselves. But one of the situations there was that our line of sight was a little bit difficult. So if the crane wasn't up along the netting where we were, then we couldn't see him, right, to reinforce the behavioral responses that we wanted. So we actually needed to let him know we were coming. So one of the things we would do is we would just talk as we were approaching, and that would let him know, hey, we're in this back area. And then he would start walking from wherever he was, and we could see him coming from far enough away that we could turn around and walk away before he actually got up to the netting. And when he got up to the netting is where we would see the undesired responses that we didn't want, like if he would poke the netting with his beak or something like that. That to us was undesired responses that we didn't want to have happening, that towards people. And if that happened and we walked away on that, then that would be reinforcing the undesired response. So what we would do is we would start talking as we were approaching. We could see him coming, and we could turn around and walk away before he even made it up to the netting. Therefore, we got the opportunity to reinforce the responses that we actually wanted. And so pretty soon he started to figure out that if he heard us talking, that meant that we were over there. He might come over to check us out, but oh, look, we left before he did anything undesired. And so very quickly we were able to shape calm responses, and it was actually an amazing training session. We were, over the course of 3 days, we were able to transition to positive reinforcement. Our goal was to train him to shift into a I don't know what to call it, like a little smaller holding area, so that he could be closed in there for a few minutes while people serviced the entire habitat without being in the same space with him. And he very quickly learned to replace aggressive responses with calm responses, shift into the holding area calmly, not coming in to attack people, but literally just coming in calmly to get food and mealworms, and people could go in there and service the space. So it was a really fantastic transformation. But we did use talking to help get some of that started in the initial stages there. And another example that was also from this facility is that there were some other animals that were more showing fear responses to people. And although we didn't practice this with them while I was there, the staff did say that, one of the things they would do, because they knew these animals showed fear responses to people, was also to talk to let them know when they were coming, even though there were probably some other stimuli that the animals were aware of, maybe sounds of people's footsteps, or maybe the rolling of the wheelbarrow, or maybe keys jingling. But they really wanted to let those animals know that they were coming as best they could, so that they could hopefully reduce any kind of fear responses as much as possible. And we also talked about strategies to help replace those fear responses with calm responses, similar to what we did with the crane there. But again, starting under conditions in which those animals could be successful. But to me, those are one of the pros of talking. We can use those as conditioned stimuli to tell animals what to expect or what's coming, and in some ways to evoke desired responses. So if you want to know a little bit more about those strategies that I was trying to quickly explain there about how we can optimize welfare by giving animals distance as a reinforcer, I will put a link to that course on this page where this podcast episode lives. And if you're a member of animaltrainingfundamentals.com, you can have access to that course and get some step-by-step instructions on how to apply that. So let's talk about another pro. So we talked about how sounds can be a conditioned stimulus, but they can also be a conditioned reinforcer. So some animals can learn to associate talking with desired outcomes. And so our talking can actually become a reinforcer, which is nice to add as an additional tool in our toolbox to reinforce desired responses. So again, we tend to think of this as something that has to be learned, right? Animals don't necessarily automatically enjoy hearing people talk. Maybe some species do, I don't know. I guess that would be something to investigate. But I think, but again, yeah, it's really, just like we think about things like clickers and whistles and saying the word good, which we think of as, we've labeled those as bridging stimuli. Same with talking. So talking could be something that becomes associated with good things, and in some places, in some situations, it can become a preferred reinforcer for some of the animals that we work with. And I think, and again, this might have to do with the ethology of the species. Some of the animals that we keep in our homes, I think the one I think of, predominantly for me, when I think about parrots, we do know that for parrots, they tend to prefer the companionship of another bird or another animal, especially those parrots that were raised around people. And so when they get separated from another bird, if they may call to find out where another individual is, and if the human calls back, even if it's to say something not so nice, like be quiet, then that can reinforce that calling. And so those vocalizations that come from people can be reinforcing to our parrots. And so those sounds that we make back and forth with our parrots can be reinforcing. And so one of the things that does happen in my household is there is sort of this inclination for my parrots to get particularly vocal as the sun is kind of getting more towards sunset in the evening, and my parrots will be vocal, and I actually kind of join in with them. I'll make sounds back and forth with them, and that's because I want to reinforce the sounds that they're making, because my parrots have all learned to make pleasant sounds, and I like those sounds, and I am happy to reinforce those sounds because I much prefer those over screaming. So I reinforce their whistling, their songs, their different little happy sounds that I guess they're happy, but they're sounds that are pleasant to me. So I do reinforce those. So my talking and singing and vocalizing with them, I do believe reinforces those sounds. Okay, so let's move on to our next one. How about this one being a pro? And at first you're gonna say, but it could also be a con. And guess what? It does fall in our con category as well. But let's look at it as a pro first of all. So sometimes talking and our vocalizations can lead to high levels of arousal, but they can evoke desired responses. And I want to give the example of situations in which we want our animals to be highly aroused. And so that might be a situation where maybe you need that animal to be really pumped up because you want them to do something that has them all fired up. And the thing that kind of jumped out to me was like competitive dog sports where, maybe that dog's going to go run agility or something, and you want them all fired up so that they just go burst with energy and run through that course as fast as possible. And maybe that particular dog has learned that, when their trainer is, talking in a high-pitched voice and saying all sorts of, words to that dog that the dog has learned are conditioned stimuli, that the animal's more likely to give this really amped up performance. So that might be a situation in which talking helps evoke desired responses. So we'll look at that in the con category in just a moment as well. So hang on to that thought if you've been thinking that, it could also be bad, because I agree it can be, but save that thought for later, because now we're going to move on to another pro about talking. I think it feels good for the trainer. Probably a lot of us can relate to this. A lot of us do enjoy talking to our animals. We like saying, oh, good boy, or good hold, or good sit, or that's it, well done, brilliant, all those words that are fun for us to say to our animals while they're doing behavior. Probably are making the training fun for us. We enjoy seeing our animals be successful, and saying those words help us enjoy the process as well. Now, sometimes when I'm consulting, I recognize that when people are saying those words, that it may not mean anything to the animal. Some animals may not really be responding to that. And I have had people, ask me if that's a problem. Do I worry about that? And I have to say, I only worry about it if I think it's impacting the training in a way that is, problematic for whatever's trying to be accomplished there. And we'll explore that a little bit with our cons here in just a moment. And also, the animal trainer may completely be aware of it, and they may be just fine with it. So a lot of times that's the situation too. I mean, I'm aware of it with myself when I'm talking to my animals, and I know it's really just for me in some cases, and it's not impacting the animal's behavior at all. And sometimes it is impacting the animal's behavior. And like I said, I recognize that it's either creating a high level of arousal, or it's a conditioned reinforcer, or it's a conditioned stimulus. And so I have that in the back of my head, and sometimes I realize it's just for me. So I don't want to presume that the person who's speaking to the animal doesn't know that that's going on. They may very well know that that's going on. So I don't stand in judgment for somebody who's talking to their animals. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. So keep that in mind if you see somebody else who's talking to their animals, or if you're one of those people that talks to your animals. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. It could absolutely be just fine. We're going to take a little break to give you your first secret word, and the secret word is crane. Secret words are important to remember and submit to show that you have listened to this podcast for your professional development. All right, back to the program. Now let's move on to those cons. Like I said, a lot of these are going to overlap with our pros. So our cons, it can be a conditioned stimulus, just like our pros. But when that happens, sometimes the animal may be paying attention to the wrong stimulus, right? So all of our talking may be a conditioned stimulus that we don't want the animal to pay attention to. Think about, what if your cue was actually some sort of, hand signal that you want the animal to pay attention to, but it's really paying attention to all these words that you're saying. And maybe you thought, oh no, I really want this animal to pay attention to my hand signal, but he seems to be paying attention to all my words. And maybe the whole team has been using hand signals, but it turns out the animal's now really been paying attention to whatever words you've been saying, and that's not the intended goal. So that's one of those things that, again, you would have to tease out and figure out, oh, maybe we've got a little problem here because we're kind of throwing too many things at the animal at the same time, and they're not really sure what they're supposed to be paying attention to. So that's one of those things where, you'll have to figure that out with your own situation. So sort of the flip side to this is that the words can start to become nothing. They may mean nothing to the animal, and the animal has started to just kind of ignore them now, and they just are kind of background noise, if that makes sense. I think an example I see sometimes is when people are working towards trying to get duration, and you'll see the words, or I shouldn't say see, I should say you'll hear the words like stay, 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 or hold, 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 repeated over and over again, with the intention that perhaps that's helping the animal stay in that position for longer and longer. And if we were really to maybe evaluate what was going on there, the thing that is probably helping maintain the position is the training, so the reinforcement history. So perhaps the animal has received training that taught it to wait longer times before reinforcers would be delivered, or maybe reinforcers are being delivered on an intermittent schedule, that the animal has actually learn to maintain position based on reinforcement history, and that the words are really just background noise, or again, for the trainer versus something that the animal's actually paying attention to. And actually, I should mention, if you want to learn more about how to train duration, our introduction to training, or how to train a new behavior course, explains how to train duration with some good video examples, and I'll provide a link to that at the end of the pod, or at the page where the podcast lives. So again, that's one of those situations where I think the animal may not really be paying attention to the words at all, and it's really just about reinforcement history. So again, that ties into that the sounds, and I kind of have this listed as another one of our cons, that sometimes our talking starts to become white noise. And then what happens is the other signals that we want the animal to pay attention to start to become less salient. They don't really stand out anymore. And so we sort of kind of wonder, are they even paying attention to any of our signals? So this kind of ties into, well, what signals do I want to have stand out? So I really want the animal to pay attention to the cue, right? The discriminative stimulus. I really want them to pay attention if I give like an indicator signal. And so to me, those are things like if I'm, say, touch right before I touch the animal. And I also want them to pay attention to the bridging stimulus. And how do I know if the animal's paying attention to these things? So usually, for me, when I give a cue or an SD, there's going to be some kind of response. And usually there's criteria for that, right? Like, we don't want to see latency. Usually the animal will give a very specific response, right? Because it's a discriminative stimulus. It's supposed to be, a specific behavior that goes with that SD. And again, we hope that the animal gives us quick response to that cue. If there's an indicator signal, typically in those cases, we're hoping that the animal remains in position, doesn't show a startle response, and they tend to stay calm and relaxed prior to, making contact with the body, if it's like a touch or something like that, if that's the indicator signal. When the animal hears a bridging stimulus, to me, a bridging stimulus is also an SD. It's also a cue for what they're supposed to do to get the reinforcer. And that might mean remain in position. It might mean break position and turn around and face me. It might mean go to a station. It's whatever you've taught the animal is the right thing to do to get that reinforcer. And so again, we sort of want to see a response. What does the animal do? Does it kind of light up when it hears that bridging stimulus? And so if those things aren't happening, then that might mean that all my talking is kind of creating a white noise situation in which my other signals are now sort of losing their significance. They've kind of lost meaning in there. So again, if I'm feeling like I'm having to repeat cues, making them louder, or that I'm not seeing these responses like I wanted, then maybe I need to go back and retrain these signals. I may need to try to not talk so much so that hopefully these can become more salient again. So these are things that might be some signals to me that maybe some of my talking is interfering with what I'm trying to accomplish. Time for your second secret word. And the secret word is white noise. All right, let's get back to the program. So let's talk about another con. Now again, this is similar to our pro. We talked before that talking can become a conditioned reinforcer. And again, it could be a con that it becomes a conditioned reinforcer. So for some animals, that talking can become a powerful reinforcer for some animals, which can also be problematic. There are times when we don't want to use talking as a reinforcer, right? When we kind of want that opportunity to be quiet and not talk. So let's say you're taking a phone call or you're on a Zoom call where maybe you can't talk. This is your moment to listen, not be talking, and you can't reinforce with talking. Or maybe it's a behavior where it requires you to listen to take data, like maybe you're listening to a heart rate or breathing, and talking to the animal in that moment would not be the right reinforcer to use. So if it's the only appetitive available, that might be a challenge. So not that, talking doesn't have value. Like we said, it can be a pro, but there might be situations where having that as your preferred reinforcer for the animal might not be the best situation. It might be nice to have some options. All right. And now, again, we're going to move on to another con that is, we mentioned in our pros, but this is sort of the flip side. So we talked about high levels of arousal that could evoke desired responses, but they can also evoke undesired responses. So this is when talking creates that high level of arousal that evokes undesired responses. And again, I seem to be defaulting to parrots here, but this happens in other animals too. But you can get some animals really amped up by talking, right? And parrots are a really good example of this. But other birds too. There are other birds that, we can make certain sounds that trigger territorial responses. And the next thing you know, we've got an animal that is in a condition in which they're very much more likely to present aggressive responses. And so this is one of the things that we really want to be careful with when we think about our talking. And so I will say that is one of the things that I find, I think contributes to me a lot of times being a calm, quiet trainer, is my concern for if I'm loud and moving in big ways, I think of it as just being sort of a big, obnoxious trainer in general. If I'm a big, obnoxious, loud trainer, will I evoke undesired responses? And a lot of times sort of being quiet and small and moving slow, I think contributes to situations in which I'm less likely to evoke undesired responses. And I think being quiet is a part of that a lot of times. So I think this is where I think I tend to default in general to being a quiet trainer, especially working with animals that I don't know very well. And this is, again, not to say that there aren't times when talking works in my favor, but I think in general, my default is to being more of a quiet trainer just because there could be the potential to evoke an undesired response. So I think an important thing here is just to pay attention to how that animal responds to talking. If you have an animal that is more likely to get aroused by talking, it's likely to be to your benefit to just, hey, I'm just going to be a calm, quiet, not obnoxious trainer, just kind of make myself small and small movements, quiet, and in general, avoid doing things that evoke undesired responses so that you can get the kind of responses you would like out of that animal so that you can reinforce them. All right. So with all these pros and cons here, does it mean that you can't talk to your animals? Of course not. No, it just means that we want to be aware of what we're saying, how it's influencing behavior. Is it creating undesired responses? Is it reinforcing? Is it just background noise? Is it confusing to your animals? It just means being attentive, right? That's always our mission as animal trainers, is being really attentive to what it is we're doing and how it influences the behavior of the animal or learner in front of us. And I think a really fun challenge is maybe try some training without making any sounds or talking, or even try doing some training in a language that isn't your own and see how that impacts behavior. So like, using a cue that's in a different language or using a bridging stimulus that's in a different language. It really kind of is eye-opening in my experience. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this discussion on the pros and cons of talking while training, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next podcast. If you liked what you heard today, visit animaltrainingfundamentals.com for more quality content on animal training. You'll find courses, community, and extensive video examples from my consulting work around the world. We'd love to have you join our force-free family.